Good evening and welcome to today's panel conversation on racial disparities in the criminal justice system, policing, and public safety. My name is Michael Deli Carpini, and I'm a faculty member and former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. For those of you who are new to this series, excuse me, this panel is the 7th of 13 we are holding over the course of this academic year as part of the preceptorial, which, as many of you know, is essentially a non-credit bearing course on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The preceptorial is designed for Penn undergrads, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. I'm pleased to say that we have close to 150 people registered for today's event. This preceptorial and the series is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn and co-sponsored by a number of other important Penn centers and offices, including the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and new student orientation and academic initiatives, all as part of the Year of Civic Engagement here at Penn. Now, while inspired by events such as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, demonstrations, and calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism, and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. Today's panel is the second of two focusing on the criminal justice system, and I should note to the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screens to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we will leave time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. Now, we have another stellar panel for today's issue and to address today's issue and your questions, and I'll briefly introduce all of them now. So if I could ask the panelists to unmute your videos so the audience can see you as I do the introductions. Thank you. So first is Monica Bell, Associate Professor of Law and Sociology at Yale University. Professor Bell's areas of research include law and sociology, law and inequality, policing and the criminal legal system, welfare and public benefits law, housing law and residential segregation, and race in the law. Professor Bell's scholarship aims to center voices of people who experience exclusion through specific bodies of law and their implementation. She uses multiple techniques for analysis, theory construction, and data presentation, with an emphasis on qualitative methodology and inductive theory building. Her scholarship has appeared in the Yale Law Review, the American Journal of Sociology, NYU Law Review, Law and Society, Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, and other journals. She's also published in popular outlets such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Washington Post, and The Appeal. In 2019, Monica received the Yale Law Women Faculty Excellence Award on a vote of the Yale Law School student body. And in 2021-2022, Professor Bell will be a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. Our second panelist is Rashawn Ray, Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Sciences Research at the University of Maryland. Currently, he is also the David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Professor Ray is also one of the co-editors of Context Magazine, Sociology for the Public. Formerly, he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and he currently serves on the National Advisory Committee for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, their Health Policy Research Scholars Program. Professor Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to the way in which inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. He's published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and his articles have appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, Science Advances, Social Science Research, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Du Bois Review, and the Annual Review of Public Health. Recently, Professor Ray published the co-authored book, How Family Matters, Simply Complicated Intersections of Race, Gender, and Work, as well as a new edition of Race and Ethnic Relations in the 21st Century. Professor Ray has written for the New York Times, Business Insider, Newsweek, The Guardian, Huffington Post, NBC News, The Conversation, and Public Radio International. He's also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, C-SPAN, and a number of other media outlets. Our third panelist is David Rudowsky, a senior fellow in the law school here at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Rudowsky is one of the nation's leading civil rights and criminal defense attorneys, practices public interest law with the firm of Carries, Rudovsky, Messing, and Feinberg. As a senior fellow at Penn Law, he teaches a number of different courses, including criminal law and constitutional criminal procedure and evidence. Among his many publications are the books Political Misconduct, Law and Litigation, and Law of Arrest, Search, and Seizure in Pennsylvania. His awards include a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, an award for accomplishments in civil rights law and criminal justice, the ACLU Civil Liberties Award, and most recently his fifth Harvey Levin Award for Excellence in Teaching at the Law School. He's also won the very prestigious University of Pennsylvania's Lindback Award for Teaching Excellence. Last but certainly not least is Vesla Weaver, the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University and former Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Professor Weaver has contributed to scholarly debates around the persistence of racial inequality, colorism in the United States, the causes and consequences of the dramatic rise in prisons, and the consequence of rising economic polarization. Despite being considered a marginal topic in the discipline of political science, which as a political science I can attest to, as a graduate student, Professor Weaver argued that punishment and surveillance were central to American citizenship in the modern era and played a major role in the post-war expansion of state institutions, and that it was a key aspect of how mostly disadvantaged citizens interact with government and was a political front lash, as she calls it, to make an end run around civil rights advances. She authored the first article in nearly 2 decades on the topic of punishment to be published in her discipline's top journal. I assume that's the American Political Science Association review, and as well as an award-winning book, co-authored book called Arresting Citizenship, The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control, the first large-scale empirical study of what the tectonic shifts in incarceration and policing meant for political and civic life in the communities where it was concentrated. Research has been supported by fellowships from the Russell Sage Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the Ford Foundation and Brookings Institute. She has written in the New York Times, Boston Review, Marshall Project, and Slate. And she's currently working on, I think this is still timely, on a new project that will map patterns of citizenship and governance across cities and neighborhoods called Faces of American Democracy. So as you can see, we have a great panel with expertise in the area of discussion today. And I want to thank you all for being here. I know you're all really busy and being asked to do a lot of this, so we really appreciate it here at Penn. Now, while today's panel is focused on the criminal justice system, and future panels in the series will focus explicitly on a number of other systems, what I would like to do is give the panelists, before we start with the 3 questions aimed specifically at our topic today, a chance to reflect on recent events. I was thinking at the time that I wrote this that could include the recent elections, the problematic transition in government, the impeachment hearings, all of which have major implications for issues of race and criminal justice in the U.S. But just yesterday, the Justice Department revived its investigation into the murder of George Floyd. And on the other side of the spectrum, no charges are going to be filed in the killing of Daniel Prude in Rochester, who you may remember was killed when being, I guess you could say, arrested by the police by having a mesh hood put over his head and then pinning him onto the pavement, and then allegedly trying to cover that event up as well. So we have two sides of the stories that we're discussing today in those two examples from just yesterday. So let me just start with you, Monica. If there's anything about any of those things that I just mentioned, or anything else in the contemporary news that's relevant to the issues that we're talking about, or this is on your mind more generally as we think more deeply, at least as a broad community, on issues of race and racism in the United States.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation with all of you today. It's really an honor. And so my initial reflection on the changes basically the decisions by the Department of Justice point to a much larger question. I think now that we are out of the Trump administration and are kind of back in a more normal of some type administration, which is, really at the end of the Trump administration, there was a lot of debate over whether we could pursue kind of typical legal strategies for reform, and whether whether it was either fruitful at all. And so there's a kind of a cleavage between the quote unquote reformist models, which would believe in that type of solution, that kind of, working through the Department of Justice, and a really growing left saying, no, that's not the way we should be thinking. We should be thinking about radical transformation, and we shouldn't expect the Department of Justice to deliver just goods or really any kind of traditional legal intervention. And so I think the real question now that we're back in normal territory is what will happen, in terms of whether whether this type of intervention to some degree take some of the wind out of the sails of more radical demands, and will you have kind of a coalition, coalescing among the left, well, not the real left, but kind of like the liberal side, to kind of pursue those routes. So that's my initial reaction.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Hopefully we can return to that point when we talk about potential solutions, what's being done, what's not being done. But Rashawn, do you want to jump in on any of the issues that are going on right now in the world before we turn specifically to the topic?
Sure. I mean, there are so many things, obviously, that we could talk about that become really important to think through. I mean, I think the biggest message, not just from this past week with these two kind of disparate outcomes, all the way back to obviously November and much of 2020, and even before that, is a lack of accountability for law enforcement. That there are not standards when it comes to holding officers accountable. What's happening in Minnesota is drastically different from what's happening in New York, drastically different from what's happening in Maryland and Tennessee and California, Arizona, and
Philadelphia.
Of course, yeah. I mean, in Philly, it's a similar situation. There's a similar situation to what happened to Daniel Pruitt in terms of mental health and responses in that regard. I mean, even in Prince George's County with Leonard Shand, and that's a situation. So I think about it in terms of a lack of accountability. So the research that we've been doing at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research is we've been working with law enforcement, collected a lot of data that I'm sure that I'll mention a little bit later. But around as it centers around a lack of accountability, we don't have federal standards. We have nearly 20,000 law enforcement agencies. They're doing significantly different things. And the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which should be voted on in Congress next month, is going to be significant for addressing a lot of the gaps and concerns that people are protesting in the streets about, that we're discussing on this particular panel. Of course, Republicans have the Justice Act. I've written about how those particular pieces of legislation are not as far apart as people would think. There are some significant things, such as grappling with qualified immunity on the Democrat side, and then on the Republican side is trying to taper the way that law enforcement is incentivized to act right and not discriminate and not act with their biases. But I think that lack of accountability can start at the federal level. Next month is going to be critical. The Biden administration is going to be held to the fire with that based on the people who put him in office. And then I would like to see how that's going to trickle down at the state level. And I know there's a lot of work in the Mid-Atlantic, for example, where a lot of us are at, but also throughout the country in terms of dealing with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights at the state level, Maryland was the first state to enact that. It might actually be the first state to repeal that. That's going to be being voted on soon. I've testified on that a few weeks ago. And so there's a lot of things happening that can drastically and significantly transform law enforcement as we know it in the next 30 days. Then it'll be a question about implementing those policies. Yeah. But for now, I think we'll worry about whether or not we'll see those things pass. And considering that Democrats control the Senate, the House, and obviously the presidency, a lot of people think those sort of things will happen.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. And a lot of topics in there that I hope we do return to over the course of the next hour. David, any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, just picking up on what Monica and Rashawn said, I agree with both of them. Kind of historically, even when we've had Democratic administrations, liberals in power, it's been a reform movement, right? What are the best practices? We had a very active and very good special litigation division in the Department of Justice that got consent decrees against, the worst police departments in the country, and that made some improvements. But I think after George Floyd, there was a moment here, and the question is whether that moment will continue, where the conversation has turned importantly away from reform, which is important. I litigate these issues. I'm going to talk about some of that, stop and frisk, excessive force, deadly force. I think that's all important in terms of accountability, but that's outside accountability. What are the courts going to do, and so on. And we can't rely on that. You're not going to have a lot of criminal prosecutions. Civil rights actions for damages are helpful, but they don't always turn it. It's really internal accountability that's going to be important. And the discussion, which I think is really critical at this point, and whether you call it defunding the police or a smaller, police presence, a smaller footprint, is really important. How do we turn some of what police do to other professionals? And there are a lot of good ideas going on about that now. And at least in Philadelphia, there's an exciting moment here. We've got a very progressive DA. We've got a progressive mayor. We've had some history of awful policing in Philadelphia. And what's going on is a conversation about both reform and changing the culture and changing what police do. There's no reason, for example, and I'll get back to this later and then I'll stop, why we continue to have, as with every major city, last year in Philadelphia, there were close to 400,000 car stops, right? And close to 100,000 pedestrian stops. A lot of those, most of them turned out to be nothing. Minor events, and often racially disparate, hugely racially disparate. And putting aside the arguments about, kind of policing and what that brings us, we now have a conversation about whether the police ought to be engaged in that, right? And how we cut back on that. And the flashpoints that we've seen, right, where these awful incidents happen are often generated by that. So it's as people said, a lot of change in the last year. I've seen that before. I've been doing this for about 50 years. I don't want to get optimistic here that, we're at a point where things are really going to change, but it is a moment of opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Again, a whole series of topics you touched on that I hope we'll go into a little deeper in a moment. But Vesla, before we turn to the three main questions, any general intro comments you want to make about events of the day or other general intros?
I'm glad you framed it that way, Michael. And thanks to my co-panelists for being here. And I've already learned from you. I think we are at a very unique moment politically. So before this moment, academics, pundits, journalists tended to isolate questions of policing from questions of democratic performance and health. And that's no longer tenable, right? January 6th happens, November election happens, the movement for Black Lives throughout the summer happens. And as a political scientist, the confluence of such a visceral and linked set of threats to democracy, from questions around, free and fair elections, to questions around racially authoritarian policing, and I'll explain that concept later, have never been more clearly connected, right? From, so immediately after January 6th, we seize on a moment when, particularly Black Lives Matter is saying, look, the treatment of white protesters and insurrectionists is so vastly different than the repression of political protesters in the months prior. And so, to my mind, this isn't just a conversation for policing scholars, it's an issue of democracy itself. And a lot of political scientists started to discuss what's called democratic backsliding, right? Particularly after Trump was elected. But often they occluded the very critiques of democracy that were being raised by the movement for Black Lives years before, right? And that was seen as, well, that's, we can reform, we can engage in some technocratic fixes, let's put some body cameras on them, rather than the consistent critiques of state power and of racially repressive policing that were coming out. And I would say police violence and collective resistance seems to always foreshadow these moments where we question democratic weakness, where we talk about democratic erosion. And yet, even today, scholars will tell you democracy is worse off due to the rise of the extreme right, due to extreme polarization, due to extreme income inequality, foreign interference in elections, efforts to call into question a free press, the decline of civic organizations, right? And not systematic wealth stripping of Black and brown communities, and not coercive institutional practices being regularly visited on those communities, and not racial oppression, right? So I would, and one of the things I want to argue today is that this moment actually gives us this kind of linking moment between white supremacy and mob violence and Trumpism and police violence can now guide an urgent focus on how to improve democracy and attend to policing as something that delimits democratic, that if we saw these things in other countries, we would be calling them authoritarian, right? They would be measuring on democratic indices very low, right? So are we finally now at a moment where we're not going to talk about disparities and bias of individual police officers and, practices of kind of disparate police organizations, and finally at a moment where we can talk about how this is influencing the extent of democratic health in this country.
That's just great. I mean, I have to say, you've all raised issues that I hope we get into that are fundamental to this. I mean, one of the tricky parts of even organizing a series of panels like this is that by necessity, it separates out what are clearly interconnected issues. And my hope that there's some interconnection that happens at each of the panels, and it's clearly happening now. So thank you for that. I'd like to start now. One of the goals of these panels is to paint a picture statistically, but more personally, in terms of the lived experience of African Americans in the United States, of what the scope of the issue is. I mean, the murder of Black men like George Floyd have made it more literally visible to a larger segment of the population, but the issues of policing and police practices go beyond that really important issue of death, of being killed. It's much more expansive than that. So I'd like to give you each a chance to paint a picture, if you will, for the audience on what is the scope of this issue. How does policing and the way it's implemented impact collectively, but the day-to-day lives of individual African Americans in the United States? And we talked before the panel that, Vesla, since you're doing some historical work on this, we'd start with you. But I also want to give you an opportunity. You hinted at it in your comments just now. When we first talked, I don't know if you remember this, like 2 months ago, you said, yes, thank you, and I really appreciate that. But you also commented on the fact that I originally structured this, and this is on me, using the term disparities, and you in a nice way, called me out on that. And I think that's an important point. So feel free also to elaborate on the point you made to me then and that you were making right now about how important the language is that we use to talk about these kind of issues.
Sure, thank you. So one of the things, and I won't talk too much about this, but one of the things that I've been doing for the past several years is collecting what we think is the largest known archive of highly policed communities, people in highly policed communities, having conversations across those communities with one another. It's called the Portals Policing Project. We took those conversations and now we're mapping them through oral histories, memoirs, testimonies, affidavits that were collected, and many of these collections never used, never known about. I mean, so, the Mississippi Black Paper done in 1964, almost no one knows about it. 57 Negro and white citizens' testimonies of police brutality and the corruption of justice in Mississippi. We've got things spanning from the first Reconstruction on forward. Many of these are oral history collections about sort of life under Jim Crow or life. Many of them are collections like the Kerner Commission reports or Crown Heights. A lot of times Baltimore, Milwaukee, Detroit, Newark, collected oral histories of people who lived through those challenges, those uprisings against policing. And what we have found is, and we by now have a very large, several hundreds of thousands of pages of testimony, right? Collective Black testimony of a sustained pattern of violence and repression that violates democratic norms. And so what I would say is that policing has been central to the machinery of racial repression in this country for generations, right? Indeed, to be Black in America is to live under racial authoritarianism, to know you don't have protection and are at once subject to discipline, right? Now, this system requires an enforcement mechanism, right? There's no racial authoritarianism without police. There's no Jim Crow without police. There's no Northern segregation without police. The entire freedom movement of the 21st century could not have been conceived without police, right? And if we look to this historical mapping, this kind of bottom-up experience of democracy in highly policed, in race-class subjugated communities across our nation's historical canvas, what we witness is several very consistent, enduring features that contravene democratic principles, and they're remarkably persistent across eras. Broad criminalization of the community, including the law-abiding. Selective enforcement of the law is widely practiced such that one could say a dual legal system exists. Access to democratic freedoms is limited, so you have stripped powers to move about freely, even if it's not instantiated in law. Restrictions on assembly that are unofficial, restrictions on voting. State violence is routine. Predatory policing is routine. Intensive surveillance permeates private space, right? Police retaliation is routine. Your personal autonomy is limited, and so on and so forth, right? I could go on and list out basically 30 features that we've identified. And when we see these features abroad, right, we tend to say that, okay, that's authoritarian policing, that's a corruption of democracy, right? They tend to score poorly on democratic indices. So I guess I would say, instead of asking what's the current state of race and racism in policing, what we really need to ask is what explains why racially repressive policing has survived every single moment to reform it. Yeah. What explains the unmatched staying power of authoritarian patterns of policing within one of the world's oldest and most celebrated democracies, right? Why has racialized policing been immune to dismantling or change, right? Why do these practices seem to persist and even expand? Why do the practices we see under Jim Crow policing become subject to sort of reproduction and renewal over time? Why is it that time and time again, Americans have shown themselves to be quite willing to turn to racially authoritarian practices, to actually democratically vote them in, to deal with problems of safety deprivation, right? And it's not to say that nothing changes over time, but I would end with this. If I can't do justice to it, but I'm amazed at how consistent the vocabulary is across these different eras. People saying, well, no, the Constitution says that, you have the right to do this, but in practice, let me tell you how it actually works, right? In practice, if you're moving in a crowd of Black men, you're going to be stopped, right? In practice, they can come into your house and search without cause. In practice, they can beat you down and ask questions later. And even the overt, and some of these quotes are just horrific, right? The overt ways in which racism comes through. I mean, I just read a quote the other day where he said, a police officer picked up a 16-year-old and he put him in the back of his car and he said, "Well, you look at the back of my shiny white head, nigger, because that's the last thing you're going to see before you end up in this jail cell." I can read this alongside testimony throughout time and show that there's a consistent pattern. And it's not just a consistent pattern of beliefs, it's a consistent pattern of practices that we can identify. And hopefully later I'll have time to read a few of these quotes.
That would be outstanding. And this project, this database, and your analysis of it sounds incredibly important. So thanks for sharing some of that. Rashawn, your thoughts on the contemporary state of these issues?
I mean, well, look, I mean, it's hard to follow what we just heard. It's powerful. And, I mean, when I think about policing and the legacy of it, one thing that my research reveals that I've been saying for a while now is that bad apples come from rotten trees in policing. And those rotten trees are imbued with white supremacy ideology and white supremacy behavior. So we know in our country, like that key question that Vesla poses, that law enforcement in the United States traces back to slave patrols. But not just slave patrols, there's a continued legacy and a continuing double down on white supremacy. I mean, we can go to look at right after the Civil War during Reconstruction, the Compromise of 1877. We can look at fast forward to the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, all these Confederate statues were being put up during the Civil Rights Movement. But there's one part with the policing that popped up as well, and that is the Emerald Society, founded in 1952 in Boston. That Emerald Society was all about preserving white supremacy for Irish Americans, firefighters, police officers. I mean, if you look at Boston, for example, and you look at the racial segregation that continues to exist in that police department in ways that we don't see in other police departments. And don't get me wrong, we definitely see segregation in other police departments, but that particular organization, which runs down through the country, even to where I happen to be right outside of DC, where they have these chapters that are kind of underground. They have these interesting terms, like in Prince George's County, they're known as the good old boys. Their Facebook page says they've been taking names and busting heads in Prince George's County for decades. And so then, of course, we can fast forward and we can think about how the Department of Homeland Security has put out a series of reports showing the way that white supremacist groups, white nationalist groups have been infiltrating law enforcement. I mean, of course, we have a long history there, but I mean, there are some very important examples in Florida. There was a police chief and one of his officers who were found to be attending KKK meetings, who were firmly part of it. In Louisiana, we had officers who were posting on social media saying, "Wow, I cannot believe COVID-19 did not kill more Black people." So, I mean, we can't detach this. And I find it fascinating. And I've heard Otis Johnson, who's now one of Vesla's colleagues at Hopkins, but he was at WashU. And then before that, one of my colleagues in Maryland, who does phenomenal work in this area. And he said on a panel that we were on together, he said, "I'm unsure, as much as we talk about structural reform," he said, "I'm unsure if culture is reformable." And it was such a deep and profound statement about the depths by which that operates. And I could tell people at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, of course, we have this very innovative virtual reality decision-making program. I actually was testifying before Congress this morning about our program in a bias and traffic stops bill. And it was fascinating hearing some of the representatives talk, because they acknowledged that racism did exist, that racism is a thing, but they always put it in a historical context. There's never nothing present about racism and white supremacy. It's all about the past, or it's simply about bad apples, which is why I say bad apples come from rotten trees. And one of the things we did a large ethnographic study with police recruits. We interviewed hundreds of police officers. We interviewed hundreds of community members. And then we developed over 100 virtual reality simulations where police officers put on virtual reality goggles. They're immersed into a virtual world of things they encounter every single day. There are a few shocking things that came out of that, even for me studying this. I'll just try to quickly mention a couple of stories to really double down on why police officers react the way they do, because I do think that it is an understandable and rational response once we understand it. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it moral, definitely doesn't make it legal. But as scholars, particularly as a sociologist, I always think, all right, how can we explain it? So I remember we were in this one session. It was about body-worn cameras. We were observing this recruit class. And the officer had on a body-worn camera. He was pursuing a person who had a gun. He told the person to put down a gun. The person didn't. The officer shot him. The officer's running over. So you see this on the body cam footage. They're running. He's running. Comes over. He says, "Hey, man, I'm going to save you." And he didn't clear the weapon. And the person who he shot pulled up his gun and shot the officer in the chest. Thank goodness the officer survived. He had on a bulletproof vest. The trainer in the room turned off the video, turned on the light, and said, "That's why you shoot center mass, and that's why you always shoot to kill." I was like, this is a body-worn camera class. Like, I mean, how did we get here? Let's fast forward to another example. There was an officer who was going through a simulation they call Milo. I kind of view it like duck hunt, kind of like don't shoot stuff, right? That they still kind of use to think about decision making. It always ends badly, like no matter what. Like it's like somebody has a gun, somebody's gonna shoot, even though most police encounters, people do not have guns. But that's what they're trained for, right? So here we go. So this officer makes the wrong decision. He gets shot in the simulation. The room is dark because you can see the screen. And the trainers are sitting in the dark with pellet guns. And then they start shooting the officer with red paint. And the pellets hurt, right? They made that officer walk around for a week with that same uniform with those red bullet wounds on him, where everyone got to see that he got shot in the simulation. What do you think he's going to do the minute he's on the street and he remotely thinks somebody has a gun, especially with all the biases that we know that he probably has of Black people? Why is that? Well, let's fast forward to one more quick example. We're in a training class teaching this implicit bias course. A trainer walks in, and there was a wall of officers' pictures. And at the time, we didn't exactly know what they were there for. He walks in, he takes out some tape. He's literally taking his time, putting the tape on the back of the sheet, plastered on the wall, and walks out. The entire mood in the room changes. And we were like, okay, is someone going to let us in on what this wall is and why you all reacted this way? And they said, these are the police officers across the country who have died since we started our police training. Now, in the grand scheme, was it a lot? No, but it was like at least 20. And I don't care how many it is. If I'm training to do that job and I see those 20 faces on the wall, I'm thinking that can be me. And so I provide those examples to say that as much as lawmakers talk about more training, no, we don't need more. Well, actually, relative speaking to other countries, yeah, our training is subpar in terms of time and in terms of content. But what we need is qualitatively different training, the type of training that we've been trying to do with virtual reality to help them with decisions to reduce bias, instead of instilling fear in this warrior mentality that puts them against the community.
Wow, that's thank you for that. And there's a lot in that when we talk about causes and solutions that I want to return to, in particular your distinction between structure and culture, because I think that's an interesting one. But before we do that, David, jump in here on the current state of policing and what its implications are for African Americans.
Yeah, no. So I join those remarks, but let me ground it in actually current policing and current data. You asked about statistical issues, and why is it that it persists? Not only in the extreme stories. I mean, we had in Philadelphia last year what was called the Plain View Project, where people were scraping off of Facebook comments by police officers. You've probably seen that, right? And 150, 200 officers posting racist and other very offensive remarks. But I'm obviously concerned about them. I'm concerned about the extremes that you see, but I'm more concerned about the routine policing that goes on. So let me just give you an example from the kind of litigation we're doing, because it's the routine policing, right? Not the extremes. You got some good police and bad police and the bad apples. But what is it that most officers are doing because of official policy, what we're thinking about crime control, mass incarceration, and so on? So we've been involved in litigation in Philadelphia now for over 10 years on stop and frisk and car stops. And so we have an enormous amount of data on who gets stopped, why they're stopped, the racial disparities. I want to talk about that issue in terms of disparities, and the reasons that police officers continue to do it. So what do we learn? And there's no dispute about this. In a city, Philadelphia, which is now about 60% minority between Latinos and Blacks, and about 35% white, when we look at the hundreds of thousands of stops of cars and pedestrians that occur each year, well over 85% of those stops are Blacks, right? Huge disparities. And of course, the response often is, well, there's more crime in those communities, there's more police in those communities, and so on and so forth. Well, when you dig deep, you find that doesn't explain it, right? We've done the regression analysis. We've factored in all the possible non-racial factors, and we found consistently, as has the city's experts in our litigation, that doesn't explain the racial disparities. Let me just give you an example. In stops of pedestrians in Philadelphia, what we find, 85 to 90% of the stops are African Americans. And what's interesting is close to 50% of those stops are what I call quality of life. It's not serious crime. It's not a weapon being produced. It's somebody who's got an open liquor container, or smell of marijuana, or urinating in the alley. Those are the people being routinely stopped. And what we see is routine, huge disparities in who's being stopped. That's regular policing, right? It's what I call serendipity policing. If you stop enough people, if you stop thousands and thousands and thousands of people, right, either in car stops or pedestrian stops, maybe you'll get lucky. You pull a few guns off the street, right? And the theory has been for years, sure, 95% of those people who stopped have done nothing wrong. They won't complain. They'll walk away, right? And the only cases that we'll see in court is where we actually find some contraband. And talking about contraband, when we look at car stops, what we find are 95% of the stops are for very minor violations, light out, too black a tint on the car, slowly going through a stop sign. Everybody does that, right? There's no racial, difference in those offenses. And yet what we find, at least from the data here, and it's true across the country, is that, again, I told you about the population here, 72 or 75% of the stops are Blacks, right? Population that's about 40%. They're twice as likely to get searched, and yet they are 34% less likely to have contraband, right? Which means when you think about that, you've got a lower threshold, whether it's for frisks or for stops, for persons who are of color than whites. I mean, that's built into, right, the policing, right? Police see somebody and they see a bulge on in their belt pan or the back pocket, right? And they think might be a gun, right? The people who get stopped for that are Blacks. It's not me and my fellow people in the city, right? So when we looked at, I'll end with this, but I'll talk about it more later. When we looked at data, and it's great to have big data. At one point, we looked at the reasons police frisk somebody for a period of time. We pulled up 150 cases in which they said they frisked them because they saw a bulge, right, in the waistband. Well, it was 90% Blacks who were frisked, and guess in this audience how many guns they found out of that 150 frisks? One gun, right? Mostly cell phones or something else. Of course, the only case the court sees is that one gun, right? And they think this officer's got some kind of sixth sense. When you look at the data, and when you look at it, which is why it's so important when we talk about transparency and new policing, to get the data, whether it's on deadly force or use of force or stop and frisk, you see the structural, the systemic flaws here. And it's not the extremes. It's not the Nazi who's a police officer, right? This is generalized policing. And that's what we've got to change. We've got to take the police out of that mode, right? And have them concentrate on what they really ought to be doing, and not creating the situations in which sometimes you get awful results, right? Because you get some resistance and then somebody's killed.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I especially appreciate your focusing on the day-to-day injustices and the implications of that. That's really important to keep on in mind as we talk about this issue. Monica, what can you add to this conversation just in this effort to give the audience a sense of the extent and nature of the different ways in which African Americans and whites are treated by the police?
Yeah, I'm going to actually kind of pick up a bit where David left off and talking about everyday policing. But I think it's important to recognize, first of all, the issues of race and policing in America are not Black versus white only, which is to say that the broader racial landscape of and the broader racial landscape of policing in America and racism is not just felt in central cities, is felt within suburbs, is part of rural life as well. We also have a massive type of over-policing with respect to, for example, indigenous communities. We also see this with respect to certain Latinx communities. And I want to elevate that in part to highlight the cultural, ideological, and legal ways and kind of mechanisms through which the policing system, as the links between race and policing are elevated. So particularly, I just want to say a bit more of a word about the cultural architecture within police departments first. So there are all these buzzwords and theories that drive a lot of policing. So we see, there are words that people think are kind of content free, like community policing, that are often used to justify particularly heavy policing in areas where racial control is desired. We also see this kind of, there's been an elevation of an idea that certain types of people, but also certain types of communities are particularly dangerous. And that has been critical in driving the private demand by white people for the policing of people of color. So this is one really key point I want to elevate here, which is that problems of race and policing are only marginally located within the police department. They're issues of how mechanisms of white supremacy generally flow. So, of course, we've seen a lot of conversation about 911 calls over the past few months in particular, although it's, there's this idea that police produce public safety. And in particular, there's been an encouragement by white people, of white people to call about the most minimal suspicion. This is interesting because, technically the 911 system is new historically. If we think about, so really 911 becomes a phenomenon of national note in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so that drive to use the police through kind of private means to call and control people who seem suspicious is actually historically new, but reflects this larger desire to kind of let white fear drive policy. And so I want to quickly say a word about the legal architecture. So, Vesla helpfully, began us off by, asking this question: why do we still have these systems? In many ways, we still have these systems because the law is set up to maintain them. And there are a couple of ones I think is important to elevate. So first, there has been an increasing judicial deference to police estimations of danger. So I was really struck by Rashawn's story about how police try to discipline each other, to be really concerned about protecting their own lives. What's important is that you bring that type of story into court in a real world fashion, and judges just defer to police assessments about what danger looks like and about where the risk should flow. So that's a general theme. Of course, laws about search and seizure really stand to reinstantiate police power to search people with impunity, even if the searches kind of begin in illegal ways. Like there's not enough constitutional protection. Of course, I mean, one of the landscape cases that gives rise and gives power to the stories David was telling is Terry versus Ohio, right? So it's like we have stop and frisk. So that's deemed constitutional. So I think what's really important for the audience to also keep in mind is not just that police are committing, questionably legal acts. It's actually mostly legal. It's often legal what police are doing that is perpetuating racism, and private racism is driving what we see. So those are just a couple of points I wanted to elevate.
That's great, and in a way that I think is great, you've really been talking at the same time, painting a picture of the issues and the problems and the way they manifest themselves. You've been talking about both the causes and the less so to this point on what might we do about them, though they're implied in some of your comments. So let me actually combine, for the sake of time, our last two questions a little bit, which is each of you could talk a little bit more about the issues you've already raised about the causes. Particularly interested, though you can go in any direction that you'd like, on this potential tension between culture and structure. I kind of see those two in some ways as being intertwined anyways, but what are the root causes of this, including the root causes being just straight out racism? But how do they manifest themselves in the law, in behaviors, in self-enforcement? But also, what do we know about ways we might address these issues? Are there places in the country that are doing a better job than others? Are there approaches that have been proposed, even if they've only been piloted or maybe have not been piloted? And in that spirit also, the larger issue, sometimes called defund the police, other times called reimagining public safety, more harkening back to some of the early comments, approaches that might be more dramatic and radical than simple minor reforms or trying to punish particular bad actors, as it's sometimes called. So, David, let me just start with you, either on the issue or both the issue of what do we think the root causes of some of these issues are that can include the kind of historic structural racism that Vesla and others have pointed to, but also, in some ways, as important, anything working, anything that you see that gives you hope.
Yeah, no. So no, I think we sketched out the history here, right? I mean, the race has been, combined in so many ways in this country, whether it's education, whether it's housing, whether it's financing, whether it's wealth, whether it's policing, right? It's an integral part in the criminal justice system. We see it. I gave you that data before. Think about when you look back at the last 30 years in the war on drugs, who gets arrested, who gets convicted, who gets sent to prison. You look at self-reporting on drugs, it's pretty even, right, by race. You look at the criminal justice system, and it's way out of whack, right? Marijuana, particularly. So we know that race is built into the structure of policing. So for me, is the question, and I kind of raised it at the top of our discussion. Given what we've tried to do before in terms of reform, as opposed to kind of this transformative period we may be in now of rethinking about police. I think we need both. And let me just go back to the stop and frisk litigation in Philadelphia to give you an idea. So after 10 years of litigation, there's actually been some changes. When we started, the police were stopping 260,000 civilians a year in Philadelphia. 50% of those stops, by the Fourth Amendment, which doesn't give you much protection, were illegal, right? We agreed on it. When we looked at the data, the police department looked at the data, literally half the stops, right, were being conducted illegally. Tens of thousands of people each year. And you had the racial disparities right on top of that. And through the kind of traditional reform measures, retraining, discipline, court orders, as of last year, the stops were down before COVID. They were down a lot with COVID, but the year before, we were down to 80,000 stops a year. The quality was somewhat better. We still had the racial disparities. So on some level, there was some improvement there. You saw the same thing in New York. You see the same thing around the country, kind of traditional reforms, using the courts, trying to convince the police departments to do better training and so on. What's required, though, is really this transformation. Why are we even doing that number of stops, right? What are we getting from it? This kind of proactive policing, right? Where we think we can prevent crime by intervening so often, again, whether it's traffic stops or pedestrian stops. And why don't we have other people doing it, right? We know what happens when an officer gets involved with someone who's having a mental crisis, right? They approach them wrong, leads to use of force. Why not have a mental health person, right, intervene there? If there's an issue about a homeless person on the street, why not someone from the Homeless Advocacy Project? Why do the police get involved in that kind of situation, right? So a lot of daily contact, right, and this reducing the footprint can be done through a kind of radical shift in the way we think about public safety. Put aside inequality, right, in terms of wealth, put aside poor schools, put aside all the other issues we have, which will provide us much more safety if we solve that. But just focusing on police, there's a lot we can do. So I think there are three things we've got to do. We've got to increase transparency. A lot of that is data, right? That shows exactly what kind of patterns and systemic patterns are going on. As Rashawn said, accountability is absolutely key. And I'm not talking necessarily about accountability in the courts, right? Whether it's criminal prosecutions, we're not going to see a lot of those, or civil rights actions, but internal accountability. Unless the police, departments own these problems, it's like any profession. Trying to rule from the outside is very difficult. Civilian control is important. Democratic controls are important. There's got to be internal controls, and a lot of that goes with the power of the FOP and the Officer Bill of Rights, where they've got super due process, and we've got to deal with that issue, and continue to build best practices. Right? We know certain things work. There's been reforms in a lot of departments, including Philadelphia. On use of force, for example, when the right kind of reforms are made, the illegal use of force drops fairly dramatically. So the kind of traditional ways we think about training and accountability and internal culture is really important. And so I think we've got to do both. I think you continue to push on the reform side, but we got to rethink what we want police to be doing in areas. Remember, and in many areas where you talk about community control, there's no single community. Some people are calling for more police, right? Some people are saying, when they come, all they do is violate our rights. It's not an easy process here. We're going to have police for the foreseeable future, and the question is how we're going to control and hold them accountable.
That's great and very concrete suggestions. Thanks. I really appreciate that. Vesla, your thoughts on, especially about what do we do, especially in light of the historic trends that you described to us?
I think there's a couple things, and I'm going to mention some data, and then I'm also going to mention the kind of broad philosophical shifts that we need. So in our political system, police have incredible structural power, infrastructural power. They have incredible amounts of discretion. They have incredible autonomy from oversight, and they're a sprawling set of 18,000 different agencies, right? Politicians, and I'm generalizing a bit, but in most localities, politicians are very scared of them. They're scared to meddle with their operations. It's sort of uncommon to have, it's uncommon for prosecutors to be ousted, right? It's uncommon for police chiefs to be reined in or to be removed, right? Other comparative politics scholars have shown in other contexts that police are powerful political actors. They have nearly unmatched power to distribute protection or surveillance, right? And over time, we invested very heavily in one type of infrastructure for enhancing safety, right? Policing, while programs that were shown to enhance safety, that do empower communities that were long relied on, collapsed, right? Politically, there's a whole host of ways that we can respond to safety deprivation, and I use that term very intentionally. But the way, over time, the way that we have conceived of this problem is about crime control, surveillance, monitoring disordered communities, rather than as a problem of safety deprivation, right? It's also, there's aspects of our legislative system that mean that it's a lot easier to pass a tough on crime bill than to pass sweeping omnibus, safety net legislation. So like if you look at Bill Clinton's programs, it's not the case that he only was promoting tough on crime legislation. It's just that once is sort of expand the safety net legislation came to votes, they were crushed, right? Every single piece. Whereas in the UK, there's a great political scientist named Lisa Miller, and she's shown this time and time again. In the UK, when safety deprivation gets raised legislatively, it tends to be passed as broad social spending measures, right, alongside tough on crime things. I think another cause is the kind of enduring ideology and currency of Black criminality, right? We constructed the idea of a Black super predator or a Black criminal, right? And police practices honed in on that. And I would, and here's where I'm going to bring in my own data, since David brought in the stop and frisk empirics. One of the things a lot of scholars, even reform experts, don't understand about what transpired over time is that it's not just that we expanded policing, that we expanded misdemeanor arrests. It's not just that we infused heavy monies into the policing apparatus, which we did, right? American cities spent on average $82 per person on police in 1951. Today, they spend $286 in constant dollars, right? It's not just that we expanded surveillance and expanded incarceration. What happened over time is actually what I would call a decoupling. What do I mean by that? Very simple. Imagine a 2x2. On one axis, you have contact with criminal justice. You were arrested, yes or no. On the other axis, you have criminal offending, yes or no. And what we can do as social scientists is we can look at those patterns over time. And what you would want in a functioning, efficient, and fair system is you would want most people to fall, most Americans to fall in the yes, yes, no, no, quadrants, right? Yes, I committed a crime. Yes, I was arrested. Or conversely, no, I didn't commit a crime. No, I wasn't. I haven't had contact with criminal justice. And in fact, if you look in the late 1970s, if you look at nationally representative surveys of Americans that follow them through their life course, what you can see is that actually the majority of Americans fell in those two quadrants. Not to say that we didn't have extraordinary racialized policing, we did. But over time, what ended up happening is we went, I just sort of mapped it right here. We went from those two quadrants to the exact opposite quadrants. Majority of Americans now fall in the yes, I was arrested, but no, I didn't do anything to run afoul of the law. Or the quadrant, yes, I ran afoul of the law. I did something to violate a municipal code or a criminal offense, but no, I wasn't arrested. And over time, we sorted the population racially into those quadrants. A much larger share of Black Americans falls in that, yes, I was arrested, but no, I haven't done something illegal. And white Americans tend to fall, right? More white Americans are falling in the other quadrant. Yes, I ran afoul of the law, but no, I wasn't arrested. That is a major problem that we have to recouple offending, right? And I'm not saying that our, the way we conceive of crime is exactly legitimate, but we have to bring those two things back together. Over time, we slipped from a system that running afoul of the law was tightly connected to being arrested to one in which it was not. And that is a problem. We under-enforce in white communities. And I think until we have that conversation, we, will still have a very illegitimate criminal justice system. I'll raise up two other points. One is on Monica's point. I'm glad that you raised this, right? You said something like, most people don't understand that policing can be completely constitutional, and that doesn't mean that it's still not, egregious, right? And in fact, the Constitution has sort of allowed police power to expand, right? And I had written down earlier, it's clear that the Constitution does not restrain policing practices. So how can we think about practices that do not necessarily violate the Constitution, but that most would say violate democratic principles, that most would say contribute to broad criminal stigma, that most would say contribute to the dehumanization of Black and Brown communities? And then finally, I would say one of the other things that I'm showing in my research a lot that I don't think we attend to enough is that the majority of people who have their first stop are stopped in very early adolescence, right? Under the age of 14. I think we need to depolice youth and instead build structures of civic empowerment, right? Why are we politically socializing youth into the habits of kissing the pavement and to body cavity searches, right? Instead of bringing them into democracy as full democratic citizens and encouraging civic habits and empowering them. And so that's another area that I think reform efforts need to focus on. Scaling back, reducing how much we have policing in the everyday fabric of youthful spaces, and instead seeing youth as future civic leaders, the next generation, and encouraging them to be empowered.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the both the heuristic of the 2x2, but also the data and the way that pattern plays out. That's really, really telling. Monica, some thoughts on what we have or can do?
Yeah, sure. So I want to share 4 quick points. So the first is I think we need to kind of put on the table that the defund and abolition movements have been really critical to a lot of the changes we had conversation about over the last hour. And in particular, people like to criticize defund and say, well, that language, I don't know about that language. And then, things like, oh, we're not going to get rid of the police anytime soon. But I think we really need to keep in mind what those movements have allowed to happen, which is a public that has made the radical seem moderate. So the fact that we have cities doing pilot programs around things like cahoots, where instead of having police and alternative kind of respond together, instead they're saying, well, why don't we just actually have an alternative response? That used to be the radical position. Now that is a moderate position. And that is quite an accomplishment. So I feel a lot of hope and excitement about that. Second, I think we've started to see change in organizations that have traditionally kind of worked within the police framework. So here I'm actually talking specifically about the law enforcement assisted diversion, where I've been doing some research specifically in Seattle. But one of the things that's been super interesting in this in-depth observation over the past almost year now is that LEAD has completely redesigned itself. And instead of focusing on working with police, traditional policing, they've instead been focused on working with other community organizations to kind of engage in a lot of alternative work. And I think that's just one example of transformation of even organizations that have been following a traditional model. So I feel a lot of excitement in that. Third, I want to say a word about police accountability and what it can mean. So police accountability could mean, prosecuting cops. It could mean getting unions to stand down so that bad apples can be punished or whatever. But it can also mean measures like reconciliation and even reparations for certain types of police injustice. And so I think what we can start to envision now is a more radical conception of what accountability might entail. And then fourth, I want to say a word again about white people, white individuals, and white supremacy. So I raised this to say that I think a lot of people who are participating in promoting racialized policing don't know they're doing it. So, that we've constructed a culture in which white people call the police about all kinds of things and threaten policing for all sorts of things. And it's now normal. It's now been naturalized. And I think education, in part through data. So data showing that, a lot of the police practices aren't actually doing anything about violence, that a lot of 911 calls are about, really nothing that is dangerous, sort of uprooting the idea that people are in constant danger of violence is really, really important work that is beginning to happen on the data and education side. So I feel hope about all four of those options.
Wow, that's thank you. Excellent points that cover a wide range of potential solutions, but that fit together really nicely. Rashawn, your thoughts? I mean, I know the work you're doing seems like it's one effort to make a difference by putting members of the police in certain virtual reality circumstances. But what are the kinds of solutions do you see out there, or do you think might be possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to build on what everyone has said. This has been a phenomenal panel. It's exciting to be on a panel with people who know so deeply about the topic and have such a range of information. So I'll double down on a few things. I mean, first, I think our virtual reality program is second to none. However, training is limited. It's just one part. And without the broader accountabilities we're talking about, the training oftentimes becomes diluted. One of the things that I will say from our trainings that we've been able to do is we've been able to link officers' attitudes, their physiology to their behaviors. And no surprise, we find that officers who have more anti-Black bias, it leads to more discrimination. Importantly, though, we've also found that when they're stressed, when they have less information, and when they, oftentimes when they're hungry and tired, that biases go on steroids. That becomes important for how we might think about policy. So I think it's a few things to note. The first thing is that, as we said earlier, that they train to the extremes. Part of what David and Monica are highlighting is the importance of training toward their everyday encounters. That's what we do with our virtual reality program. 90% of calls for services are nonviolent. I want to be very clear about that stat because people have essentially said it, but we got to be clear about that. 90% of calls for service are nonviolent. Doesn't mean something can't turn violent, but overwhelmingly, they are not violent encounters. And oftentimes, some of the most extreme ones are police officers actually escalating the situation themselves, like we've seen in some of the incidents that we talked about. A few other things. The big one, I think, that my research has suggested to increase accountability is police department insurance policies. From 2015 through 2020, U.S. taxpayers paid out over $2 billion in civil settlements. That's money that could go toward local communities, to local programs, to the sort of things we want to see. Instead, our taxpayer money is going to paying toward these civil settlements, overwhelmingly where law enforcement are not held accountable civilly or criminally. So the other part of this needs to be, of course, we need to do something with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, but we also need to create community oversight boards that are similar to what we see in Nashville. That's one of the best ones, where they get funding from the city. They actually have representation and votes on the internal misconduct board. I want to be very clear about how this operates. There's actually accountability among law enforcement internally. I mean, they wreck their car, do something like that, they get in trouble. Oftentimes a lot of trouble. They get fined, they get suspended, they get put on desk duty, things that are highly stigmatizing in the grand scheme of things that do affect them, even though they don't have a lot of external accountability to the communities they serve. Having community oversight boards that have representation and votes within those committees become important for transparency, accountability, and equity. When it comes to defund, I want to double down on something that Monica said, because there is a lot of evidence, and I've written about this extensively, that there is a lot of support for defund the police. what we say when we're in policy spaces in Congress and in state legislatures is we say reallocation. And in fact, that's been happening for a very, very long time, reallocating funding. And let me tell you why this needs to happen. If we take a market-driven, evidence-based approach to police funding, we get a similar result, but we start out with a different set of variables. Let me tell you what I mean by that. In Oakland, for example, over 40% of the budget is spent on policing. 40%. That's drastically different from the 20 or 25% that might exist, say, in Washington, D.C. So defunding in Oakland might mean taking 5 to 10% of that budget off, reallocating that funding to mental health services. I did my postdoc at Berkeley. I live in Oakland. Even though mental health is pervasive in a lot of places, it's really pervasive in that part of the country. I think it has a lot to do with weather and the fact that since the weather is fairly consistent year round, you have a particular homeless population there. But I say all that to say that's an example of something that could happen. The other thing we need to think about is not just reallocating, but shifting funding within the police budget. So I have a data set of about 8,000 police officers on their mental health. 80% of those officers suffer from chronic stress, depression, and anxiety. 1 in 6 are suicidal. 1 in 6 report substance abuse problems. 90% of them never seek help. We also know that white officers are less likely to live in the neighborhoods where they police or even within the jurisdiction where they work, whereas Black and Latino officers are more likely to. We need to create certain incentives and also take certain mandatory requirements, particularly for early officers to live in the places where they work to really create community policing. So look, we know what the solutions are. We just have to have the political will to do it. I think in this Department of Justice, we're going to have a lot of consent decrees because look, there are tons of investigations that were not investigated under the Trump administration that should have been. So I think that's going to create a lot of change. But that George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is going to help a lot as well.
That's great. I mean, I want to thank you all. We have already run a little long. I did want to mention a couple of the questions. I don't think we'll have time to give any kind of real answers to them, but I thought they were interesting. I wanted to give you a sense of what some of the audience is thinking. One, at a level of thinking about solutions, one of our audience members asked whether even kind of seemingly unrelated policies and practices like the pressure or incentive for fines and fees within police departments can sometimes lead to an exasperation of some of these kind of practices, which I thought was an interesting point. And if any of you would like to comment quickly on that, you can. The other was, Vesla, you mentioned how rarely public figures will go up against the police or up against prosecutors, but at least in a few cities, including Philadelphia, there are more progressive attorney generals and district attorneys rather, and prosecutors, and you see that same conflict. It's just internal now. It's the police going up against those attorney generals. But do you see any hope in what role do prosecutors play in the ability to control or not control some of the issues we've talked about? We really don't have much time, but Vesla, if you wanted to maybe comment briefly on that last point.
On the role of prosecutors?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen is truly historic. I mean, prosecutorial elections are like, if we think many Americans don't vote in midterm elections, right? Prosecutorial elections tend to be low information, very low engagement elections. And I think one of the things that has happened, beginning with Kim Foxx in Chicago on through, there have been a number of prosecutorial elections that have garnered a lot of citizen interest, and where prosecutors who were seen as engaging in very bad practices and not holding police accountable, have been ousted. And a lot of that was due to grassroots, very youthful activist campaigns that brought attention to prosecutorial behavior. I think, one of the best books on this recently is by John Pfaff, who really shows us that we don't know much about prosecutorial behavior, right? We don't actually track what they decide to charge, why their behavior has changed so dramatically over time. And so his call is a call to collect more data on what prosecutors do. and that they are one of the significant and often overlooked reasons for increasing incarceration and case filings over time. It's not an area I particularly, study myself, but I found his work to be very, very compelling. And I guess if I could, I would just end by I hate having these conversations and not actually relying on some of the testimony that I've collected and that regularly occur. I don't think we can have this conversation just by talking about statistics, but actual narratives. I think it was David that talked about sort of, under policing is as great a problem, and that these are kind of two sides of the same coin. One person says, the police where I live at, they just take a long time to get there. Like, you can call them for anything. It don't matter what it is. And they be talking like they don't got enough force out here to come and help you when you really need them. But they be harassing people who ain't got nothing, absolutely nothing. Yeah, they do shit when they ready to do it, when it's beneficial to them. They don't really care about how you is. And what's interesting is that pattern I see a lot in the data. People saying they hem us up for minor trivialities, and yet when we are, steady dying, or when stuff is really going down, or when we're in crisis and we call out for help, they're nowhere to be found. And you see that historically as well. So one person from the Jim Crow narratives says, you call the police, they don't come out here. You call them and they don't pay you any attention. But that's Jim Crow to me, she says. And the interviewer says, what do you mean? That I have to pay taxes to have police protection and I can't get it. So I'll just end on that note. I think it's important
if any of this, I don't know how far along in doing any analysis of this, if there's anything that you've written, if you just send it to me, we'll put it on the website for this set of panels so so people can get a chance to look at that. I mean, I'm trying to be, we could go on forever. This has been a fantastic discussion and I want to thank you, but I'm cognizant of your time and the audience's time. I want to apologize to the members of the audience who asked questions we weren't able to get to, but I hope we at least indirectly got to them through the conversation. And I'd like to encourage our audience members to attend our next panel, which is actually next week. It's the first of two on the education system in the United States. This first one will be focusing on preschool through high school. The panel will take place next week on Tuesday, March 2nd from 5 to 6:15. The registration information has already been sent out, but we'll send more. And we have another great set of panelists, so please spread the word and consider joining us. And with that, I'd really like to thank our panelists. This has been just a great, really terrific conversation. One of the things that I'm left with is, and I hope I'm not putting words or feelings in your mouths or your heart, but I sense optimism about the current moment. And I hope that that's true. Some of that will depend on what we do and what the public does and keeping the pressure on. But that was a great thing to hear running through your comments. And I just want to thank you all for giving your time tonight. Thank our audience, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope to see you all at future panels. Thank you very, very much.